Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Josephine Watson, and I'm the Commercial Projects Editor at iGaming Business. We're happy to be hosting a webinar for Onfido this afternoon, which will be discussing new verification regulations. There will be a Q&A session following the presentation, so please do submit any questions as we go along, and we'll try to address as many of them as possible in the allocated time. Our host today will be Christina Thakor-Rankin, Principal Consultant at 1710 Gaming, and James Baston Pitt, Senior Business Development Manager at Onfido. Christina Thakor-Rankin is a Principal Consultant at 1710 Gaming, working with startup, evolving and established operators internationally, regulators and industry groups covering all aspects of the gaming and gambling cycle. This also includes from initial research, license and operational go-live to new markets and opportunities, customer engagement and experience. She has over 20 years industry experience and has previously held roles at William Hill, Blue Square, Tote Sport and Virgin Games, managing multiple businesses and disciplines. James Baston Pitt is Senior Business Development Manager at Onfido, specializing in the online gambling industry, and he has over a decade of experience working with innovative digital businesses. So, as we're all aware, big changes are underway in the industry, and as of May 7th, operators will be required to comply with much stricter age verification rules. So getting your customer due diligence right is now more important than ever. But adding more friction at the point of onboarding means you may risk alienating your users. So in today's webinar, we'll take a closer look at the regulation and guidance around age verification, money laundering, and responsible gambling. We'll talk through some of the challenges these regulations are posing to operators and share some best practice on how to tackle them. So to start with, Tina, could you give us a bit of background on the regulatory landscape and how we've got to where we are now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be fair to say that most people who've dialed into the webinar will already be familiar with the fact that we already have a number of regulatory obligations in terms of player verification. What we have had historically is a 72-hour or 3-day grace period between onboarding a customer and absolutely being able to say they are 18 plus and they are who they say they are. That has been incredibly helpful for no other reason than not everybody is verified the moment they sign up an account for any number of legitimate reasons. It has unfortunately left a little bit of a loophole where the same 72-hour period which allows operators a degree of leniency in terms of commerciality has allowed in potentially or allowed the opportunity for some people who might be under the age of 18 to sneak in. Now, when we say the law is changing or the rules are changing, the principles are not changing, i.e., as a regulated business, as an adult business, we should only ever be accepting customers who are over the age of 18 or whatever the age of majority is. What is changing is that that 72-hour grace period disappears from the 7th of May. This means we actually have to do the positive 18 plus check at the point of registration, not further down the line when they make a first deposit or 72 hours after they've made a deposit and played. We check the age before we do anything else, including free play, accessing gambling content, and before they make a deposit. Why has it come about? I think a number of reasons. Firstly, people are becoming much more socially aware of the dangers and the risks of all activities, not just betting and gambling. Lots of industries have seen this, including the food industry. Secondly, we now live in an age where under 18s or children are much closer to adult activities than they've ever been before, because of things like the internet, mobile phones, all the rest of it. And we're just in that space where I think a lot of things have combined, including perhaps a couple of negative stories about operators who perhaps have not always been as diligent as they should have been. We have to remember we are a Me Too industry. If one operator is put up there as not having done the right thing, or there have been failings, it's not just that operator that hits. The whole industry is hit with the perception that perhaps there are holes all over the place. That's essentially where we are at the moment and why.
And James, you work closely with operators in this space, especially risk and compliance managers. So how are they managing these changes?
Thanks, Josephine. I mean, ultimately, it's a very evolving market, and compliance and businesses are strongly, I guess, focused on working collectively within the vertical they operate in. So speaking to their peers to ensure that they have standardized practices that are consistent and deemed to be robust enough to achieve, I guess, the goals which are set out by, I guess, their own policies, as well as those policies set by the regulator, I guess, the governments that are advising or regulating the space that they operate in. Now, ultimately, it's an evolving space where you've got to assess the ability to access. It was like what Tina mentioned before. It's such a great point how, I guess, this is a completely unknown to us around, we're in a completely evolving space, digital space, where the ability to access services has become far easier, and people are maybe maturing at a far greater rate because they're able to access things which really they shouldn't have that level of access. So I guess it's I guess right now there is a great need for direction. And it seems to be at the moment, I think, a little bit of that standard practice that was there being shaken up a little bit, and we're seeing a real varied amount of operators approaching this and asking us many different questions about how can we do this differently. And that's certainly a very positive thing to do, because I think there is a great need right now. I think that's what the call from the regulator is, to say, how can we do this differently and how can we make things better for consumers?
So based on what both of you guys have sort of covered, then confusion seems to be a bit of a common theme here. Tina, can you give us some clarity on some of these recent regulations and what they really mean in practice then?
I think, again, I go back to my point that I don't think the regulations have changed fundamentally. All we've done is say these are the principles the regulations are built around. We want some of these principles to actually be implemented in a more robust fashion. So, for example, the age check, the verification check, it could be done 72 hours after gambling. We now need that check to be done before gambling is enabled. In terms of money laundering and social responsibility, those obligations have always been there in the licensing principles. There is an obligation. One of the licensing principles is keeping underage individuals and vulnerable people away from gambling, and keeping crime out of gambling has always been there. The other licensing objective, of course, is fair and objective and open gambling, transparency. What we're seeing now is all of these three different principles, some of which are covered by the Gambling Act, some of which are covered by other pieces of legislation, all coming together. And again, this is exactly what you would expect within this industry as it's constantly evolving. We know people who are addicts, whether it's to gambling, alcohol, drugs, there is a higher propensity towards criminality in order to fund the habit. So it is absolutely logical that if you have a drug habit which is fueled by criminality, it's entirely possible that you will have a gambling habit that is equally fueled by criminality. This is not necessarily regulators coming out here and kind of making up new connections and dots. This is regulation really catching up with what's happening in life. And again, that's nothing to do with regulators necessarily. all regulation generally is slightly behind what's happening in life. We also now have stricter penalties in terms of compliance. For a long time, not just the UK, most regulated regimes, operators have kind of taken the voluntary route, embraced the regulation, and gone out there and ensured the industry is clean. What we have had, as with any industry, and especially, I think James is right as well, the internet has put us in a space we never thought we would be. We can now do things from the UK which previously would have involved perhaps getting on a plane. The internet has got rid of all of that. So what we've seen is a few bad apples come in who have pushed the boundaries, changed the competitive landscape, and what they've effectively done is cross a line which had previously not been crossed, which has meant regulators have had to go in there, do a lot more by way of audit and inspection. And what they've found increasingly is there is a pattern where money laundering, where criminality and social responsibility or problem gambling is getting closer and closer together.
So all in all then, it seems like this is a positive move, but one that is going to throw some obstacles in the path for a lot of operators. James, can you tell us about some of the pitfalls that they should be aware of?
Yeah, certainly. So I guess kind of just to follow on as well from what Tina was saying there, I guess there is this. I guess the challenge ultimately now is this: the big pitfall is the ability to now in the digital world, the online world, is ultimately access is a great opportunity to win lots and lots of customers, but also it's a big challenge to then know what I guess what I would call friendly friction you put in place to help mitigate the successes that people are seeing when it comes to being online. And I give an example. I could talk probably personally. I myself grew up in the little town of Newmarket, and unfortunately at the age of 15 I could go into a bookmaker's and have a bet. But the challenge there is as much as that's something we want to try and avoid, and there is suitable age verification opportunities. But if I was to go and do that, I may get into one bookmakers, and that's the only impact in the industry, just one bookmakers rather than every single one allowing me to bet. But ultimately, the opportunity now to choose multiple operators online is a great opportunity as a youngster to be able to basically run wild ultimately. And I think what right now is the challenge is this lack of I guess this big deviation between the ability to see someone in person and the ability to trust that in person is the same person remotely. That is the same person who's online. And I guess the big shift here is potentially moving more to the financial service space, where, like I say, there is a huge level of friendly friction there, which is far more focused on the identity. Because if we look at what age verification is, it is actually at a higher level. It's identifying who that person is. This isn't KYC. This isn't know your customer here. This is just a component of it, and then a very specific component around identity. So no longer is there this case where I guess online operators have this great access of spotting AML, because they can see the behavior of that person, the transactions happening of that person, the way they deposit. That indicates a risk profiling of what a user is, or what the profile is, but it doesn't help give confidence of what the identity of that individual is. And that's where I guess we see, I guess, this level of age verification is really leading to saying, actually, operators, give me real confidence to know who that person is. Tell me who the identity of that individual is. And one of the key parts of that is ultimately knowing how old they are.
So then I'm sure all of these experiences will sound really familiar for a lot of people on the webinar today. What are some of the practical measures then that people can take?
Yeah, so I mean, In terms of practical measures, I guess there is to go over that. I mean, ultimately, internally, I guess we need to address some key parts. One is, if we look at it, ultimately, we are in a regulated space here. There is a fear of fines. Means operators ultimately have quite a lot of anxiety around which players are accessing their services. So one control there, right, to look at it is being able to have greater confidence in identifying who that person is, and then when what that for me means is having greater confidence in knowing who the legal identity, who the individual, not only, I guess, tying the credentials of what that individual is to actually who that person is signing up. And that ultimately could be such things as dare I say it, using such things as biometrics, which will be a very new element to the online gaming space. And there's also, I guess, a sense that the existing process are no longer serving them in terms of being able to properly know their customers. So what that means is this key element right now is in the operator world. Right now, it is very easy to sign up and benefit from the services that the operator is giving, without the actual confidence that operator again is able to tie that payment to that individual who is actually the actual person behind the screen. So what that ultimately means there is this potential rejig of focusing on less so on verifying in the more common means, so electronic verification checking, and actually potentially focusing on verifying people's identity documents, similar to how you would when you would go into a bookmaker's high street and you would be asked to prove who you are. You would typically be reaching into your wallet and showing your ID. The last bit, I think, and then there's definitely a frustration, is the guidance isn't yet particularly clear. So fines are heavy, but rules about when to perform certain customer due diligence measures and what qualifies as sufficient KYC is still yet unknown, and what tech ultimately exists could be used. I mean, what is deemed to be the right standard? So I think there is a need to redefine what that standard is, and I think we're definitely in that transition stage. And operators have responded extremely well over the years to all sorts of challenges. Like I say previously, a huge focus around putting greater controls in AML, the risk of AML. This is now more stronger focus on the risk of responsible gambling. So I know collectively, and there's some great initiatives going on between operators to discuss how, kind of really to discuss what the new best practice should look like. And I think I should really touch on here that this is really about the digital space here. This is not about the in branch, on high street scenario. It's really about taking that on high street trust that you have and bringing that confidence into the remote world. Because, and just to end on there, like right now, it's a lot of people are wearing masks. So you wouldn't let someone go into a high street bookmaker's wearing a mask and you to tell them, this is my name, this is my age, this is my address, and you to go, yeah, great, and here's £20 and put a bet on. You don't know who that person is, and that really, unfortunately, is the way you're operating online at the moment, and that is what leads to the challenge of age, or not being easily identifiable. And also, I guess this growing element around responsible gambling. You can't ultimately identify who that individual is to help stop them and help them prevent themselves from gambling again in the future if they have excluded themselves.
So then a lot of these legacy systems and behaviours seem to sort of be causing some difficulties and challenges. What sort of some of the new approaches, new technologies, practical measures people can use?
So one well, one big practical measure that people could use is looking at, like I said, if we are taking a view right now that verifying someone's identity is actually the key to access, which we certainly believe, to give access in a positive way, but also to prevent access as well. And right now, actually, the regulator is talking about preventing access, which unfortunately for the operating world, that means creating more friction for those people who potentially want to use your services. And that's ultimately what's happening right now, where we are going from 72 hours to immediately before you can access free games, or even put a bet on a football match or a horse race. So there's key three pillars to that. Is one, you want to still do things incredibly quickly. You want to have greater confidence on knowing who that person is, and you want to be able to address as many people in an automated way. You want to automate more. I mean, that's one of the key parts. So there is some great tools out there from a technology element to be able to identify who that person is. The first one is biometrics, and being able to tie biometrics to legal identity. So we are in a position now where you can create very, very seamless journeys where you can ask customers, whether it be via their mobile or their desktop, to prove who they are. That case of, it's kind of led, if people are familiar on the channel, around this element of PSD2. So knowing something they have, something you are, and something you know. And the key part here is being able to use your biometrics, which is something you are. It distinguishes yourself far, far better than that of potentially your address or your email address, which is easily creatable. So bringing biometrics further up, bringing biometrics full stop into this space, and then combining that with ultimately a secondary point, which is using an identity document. And we're seeing a lot of operators taking a very forward-thinking view here. That this is where the regulator potentially is looking to better safeguard individuals, and something which to be introduced now is obviously going to help mitigate any business revenue business impacts that may to impact them further down the line.
And then, Tina, what are some of your sort of views on how people can sort of approach these challenges?
Okay, I'm just going to take a step back and go back to the point made by James about biometrics. And this is based very much upon a personal experience last week, actually on Saturday. I was away on business and I flew back. On the flight back was a sports team. It was, I would say the average age was 14, 15, school sports team. Two of them were sitting next to me. Just before 3 o'clock UK time, they both logged on to gambling sites, UK gambling sites, and they were discussing what bets they were going to place, which operator had the better odds. Now, I would stake every penny I had that these guys were well under the age of 18, not least one of them, their voice still hadn't broken. I don't, looking at the sites they were playing on, I don't for a second think the operators would not have done KYC in terms of age and ID. I suspect these individuals had opened accounts using parents' names or older family members, but they were placing bets openly. They would have passed electronic due diligence. Most likely, had they been asked to provide photographic ID, they would have been able to do so. I don't know what payment method they were using, but I can tell you that I have 3 or 4 prepaid accounts that I have actually opened where the age is not 18 and the name is not mine. So it's getting much, much easier for these youngsters to actually access not just gambling products, but any over 18 product over the internet. So what James was saying about biometrics is getting closer and closer to us. If you want to be absolutely certain of who it is that you're interacting with behind that screen, biometrics is the only way forward, and it's going to have to be biometrics at login. So I think those are some of the things we absolutely have to start thinking about now. Yes, there's always going to be pain points in terms of user experiences. The other thing we need to be aware of, whether we're operators or regulators or just general commentators, there is no silver bullet solution to any of these things. For businesses, there's always going to have to be that choice between cost and compliance, and that would fall into your risk assessment. So to the point James made, I think biometrics is the only long-term way of trying to know who is behind that particular screen. In terms of the player experience, I think it's going to be interesting. And the reason I say it's going to be interesting is there are actually already some operators who do 18 plus KYC check as part of the onboarding process. So there will be customers out there who currently have a number of different user experiences for onboarding, depending on who they're playing with. From the 7th of May, this applies to absolutely everybody. So yes, absolutely, there may be for a short period of time that slightly disruptive experience for those customers who have not been asked to provide KYC right from the start of the relationship. But very quickly, given everybody who has a UK license is going to have to fall into line with this, I think the concerns about customer friction and customer expectations will disappear very quickly. I think what will then become a new friction is how operators go about adhering to their obligations in terms of money laundering regulations and social responsibility. That is where we're going to start to see differences in terms of operator approach. And that is where the use of technology could actually be a differentiator for an operator. We all know, just as end users, as customers, if we are trying to do something online, whether it's Amazon, whether it's eBay, whether it's Paddy Power, William Hill, Bet365, Ladbrokes, everybody, you're trying to buy something. In the case of gambling, you're buying a spin or a bet. Any friction or anything unexpected in that process, whether it's on screen or whether it's an email which says we need to interrupt the flow to be able to do A, B, C, D, is going to introduce friction. So the challenge for the industry is how do you turn something which could be friction and negative into a positive experience? Well, the obvious thing is don't say to customers, we think you might be a fraudster, so we're going to do source of funds checks. Far more gentler experience if you explain to them, we're trying to keep you safe, we're trying to ensure that you're playing within your means. So that kind of initial communication and messaging can be quite important. The second part goes back to James's point, the technology and the way in which you manage things, such as enhanced customer due diligence. The moment you say to somebody, send us something, which is how we've historically done things, is always going to be interrupting the process, perhaps suspending the process if the customer can't continue until you've actually completed your checks, in which case you run the risk of that customer going away and not coming back, or angering the customer because you're suggesting by implication that maybe you don't trust them. If there are technical solutions and tools which allow us to access the information from sources which are not necessarily the customer directly, I think absolutely they're things we need to look at. They remove some of the friction. They actually allow us to do a lot more monitoring and identification of dangerous customers or customers who might be about to kind of start to show signs of problems or behaviours that we should be looking at. Mostly, it will allow us to present an experience to the customer that is palatable. And it's all about that. It's all about saying to the customer, we trust you, we want you to play with us, we want you to play in a safe experience, garner the information we need that allows us to keep that bubble of safety for the customer, but also for our businesses, without any communications which perhaps require the customer to do something they wouldn't normally do, or put the customer in a place where we're perhaps questioning their integrity, if that makes sense.
And James, then, what are some of your sort of final thoughts on other things that operators can be doing in this space before we head on to our Q&A session for today?
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be good continuity across the board here. We still need to obviously that element that we talked a little bit there, just around I guess this key to access here is to make things again seamless. We want to balance the risk. The regulator has this great element around this risk-based approach, and that's a really important key point there. You don't want to create too much churn or too much operational and compliance overheads internally, as well as you don't want to create this operational pain for a customer to start providing what would be deemed to be potentially sometimes unnecessary information. So removing fear and protecting that customer is obviously going to be something that resonates, but it's going to require a change. And that's I guess this key point here, that right now there isn't this element around having to do strong, you could say, enhanced due diligence. This need to take what you do in branch to online, so using biometrics. But if you do that, you bring that in, you potentially could start looking at how you can ask for less. And in doing so, you improving your flows. So for instance, here's a nice example. We've launched this ability which not only could help solve age verification, but could also help mitigate the risk of being unable to identify someone who has self-excluded themselves. So the biometric obviously is a far more powerful tool than, say, your email address or your actual address. It's something that doesn't change. So we've got a tool called Known Faces, where we're able to tell the operator whether they've seen this face before. Now that might be someone who had self-excluded themselves. It might, and that what's quite cool about that, and as I know, there's quite a lot of operators who have multiple front-end, brands that people can sign up to, and there is this ultimate headache of being able to be able to spot someone who's self-excluded themselves on one site but not the other, and ultimately we've already seen huge fines associated with that, and that ultimately there is not only a great way of protecting yourself but also protecting consumers. And this is ultimately a transition which, on the face of it, if you've not done it before, seems, God, horribly frictionful. No one's going to want to start staring at their face. But what we've found in this field, certainly in the financial service space, who have never done it, is it's so widely adopted of all ages. Because ultimately, if someone trusts your brand and wants to have a bet on your site, then they're doing a lot. I mean, a good example is if they're giving you their money, then why shouldn't they give them their own identity? Because we heard this case of people don't like showing their face about their identity. Well, if they're willing to potentially put £150 or £1,000 into your account, then that's quite a big investment of trust into your site. So become more confident in saying, look, I want to know who you are. I want to be able to better serve you. So if you do self-exclude yourself in the future, I'm actually going to know who you are. It's such a more positive position around being able to be able to better serve people. But when you do that, you also help become far more inclusive. So right now, the traditional world is very electronic based. So you're using lots of databases to verify people's identifiable information, so name, address, and date of birth. And broadly speaking, within the UK, it's pretty good. You hear most people say, okay, yeah, it's great. It's about 80%, 80 plus, and it's only 20% of people who churn. It's not a great problem. But actually, when you start diving into the detail of where the of what the pass rates look like, you actually start seeing, and it might actually align to your business model around who you're of some potential limitations around, I guess, the core demographic that you potentially might be going after. So, good example now is a lot of businesses are now transitioning to mobile, where you're seeing a lot of, I guess, 18 to 34-year-olds potentially using that as their primary tool to sign up to new services. And ultimately, when you actually break down, I don't know if it just could be a really good exercise if there are operators on the call to say, look, I want to know exactly by age what the pass rates are. If I can't currently tell you what they are. And this might obviously prove a very strong business case to show that actually there is a ceiling to what you can do here. So let's just rewrite the rule books and not only achieve age verification, but also make a huge giant stride to be able to have confidence of someone's identity to help solve this challenge of being able to provide more responsible gambling to people.
Great, well, thanks both for a really well done presentation and some really good insights in there. We'll now be moving on to the Q&A segment of our webinar session. And we've got some great questions that have come in already, but please do continue to send them in and we'll try and tackle as many as we can in the allocated time. So first and foremost, how smooth do you think this changeover is going to be on May the 7th? And what will happen to the players that fall through the cracks?
Who is that director there?
Do both, can we? Do you want to respond?
You can go first, James, if you like.
I guess I think there's going to be probably a relative element, Josephine, of the unknown. I think the impact is going to come in twofold. One is ultimately a case of having, I guess, that MLRO or that compliance lead there to be confident enough to say, do we know the age of these people who are currently using our services? And it sounds like there is potentially quite a widespread remediation exercise already needed to be kicked off on existing users. That's not necessarily potentially a huge headache in terms of it depends what position you take there. If you were to say there is that line of saying actually I don't know, and you're going to completely prevent that player from then gambling further until they age verify themselves, then ultimately there's going to be potentially a huge manual headache in the operational side, and also potentially a big UX and a customer satisfaction element if it's not easy, trustworthy, and safe, so people understand. We realize when it comes to verification that you've got to really, people need to if they're going to provide something personal to them, such as identity, they need to understand why they're doing it. So there's a huge educational piece that's really important from the regulator and also the operator to ensure that you have really good user engagement. That leads very nicely on to what happens for acquiring new customers, which there is a huge amount of spend ultimately on marketing and incentivizing new customers to sign up to sites. And ultimately there is this very much this very, I guess, reactive and very limited expectation on seeing things done instantly. So again, there is needing to be a real big focus on how seamless it is for customers to be able to age verify themselves, and how easy it is to provide information and verify information. So a big element here is, I mean, we use machine learning to be what we perceive, well, to be better than a human. That is the key objective here. When we say better, it means more accurate, faster, and scalable. So being able to address the great volumes of people when they sign up to have a bet for the Grand National or what's coming up, all the Masters last week, where there is I guess a great spike of demand that is very hard to handle in-house or manually. So there is a great opportunity to use technology in this field, both from a back end and from a UI UX element too.
I think from my perspective, and this may not be the popular reply, but as a practicing compliance officer, I think this change coming in on the 7th of May is not new news. We've been aware of it since February now. We knew before February there was a good chance it was going to come in. If you are operating under a UK license, the only players really it should affect is those who signed up 3 days before the 7th of May and who weren't verified or have not been verified within that 72-hour period prior to the 7th of May. Because if you haven't been able to verify somebody, the account should be suspended anyway. The savvy operators, and as a punter myself, I've actually seen this starting to go out there. The savvy operators are actually contacting players who perhaps sit between active and dormant account status, contacting them and saying to them, we need you to verify your account. So they're actually being slightly proactive prior to the 7th of May. If somebody has not used the account for a period of time and then suddenly appears on the 8th of May, they haven't been verified previously, well, you should be doing kind of ongoing due diligence anyway, just as a matter of security. So for me, the impact is going to be on those players who registered an account 3 days before the 7th of May and who are not verified. But again, they should be aware because you've had the 72-hour messaging going out anyway. From the 7th of May, all customers are going to be treated in exactly the same way if you're a UK customer playing with a UK licensed operator. Where we might see a little bit of impact is the fact that it's a bank holiday weekend potentially, and they do tend to be a little bit busier traditionally. But for me, the kind of clever operators are already on message with this. They are contacting customers who are likely to hit a hard stop on the 7th of May. They will also be making sure that they are very proactive in their messaging from, I don't know, the 5th onwards maybe. So on the website it says, you know, 18s only, we do everything we can to keep children away from our gambling sites, etc.
And then I guess sort of taking that top level view now, obviously this hasn't even come into play yet, but what do you think's next? What do you expect will be sort of other new regulations that will come through in this area?
I'm happy to take a punt on this. Some of this is based on the ongoing consultations. Some of this is based just very much on the way life is going generally with any product where there is a perception of risk or harm. I think the first two things we're likely to see is a change in respect of credit cards. So people can use credit cards online to play, to deposit and play. This is not necessarily the case for non-remote gambling. There is a consultation on at the moment. The fact that you can use credit cards on one channel but not another is a little bit of a kind of mismatch approach. So I suspect, very much suspect, that at some point there will be restrictions on the use of credit cards as far as gambling goes. There is also the amendment to the 4th Money Laundering Directive, which we lazily call the 5th Directive. That includes something about prepaid cards, and that proposes that anonymous transactions using prepaid cards are restricted to €50 only. So that's something which will impact all operators, I think, because pretty much everybody I speak to takes prepaid cards. I think further down the line, we might start to see restrictions on how much any player is allowed to deposit prior to Yeah, or rather subject to source of income, source of wealth checks being done. And again, this is very much under the banner of social responsibility. Should players be allowed to deposit up to £5,000 only to find out a week later that maybe they're on government benefits or their monthly income is £2,500? So those are the three things which I can see in respect of betting and gambling regulations coming in. There may, of course, be other things related to advertising and marketing that might come out in parallel.
Brilliant, thanks, Tina. And James, did you have any sort of view? I know you sort of working quite closely with operators, but also risk management people. What would you say you expect would be next in this space in terms of regulations?
So there's this great relationship ultimately between the operators themselves and in terms of how the position that they take. Because like I say, typically regulation comes after a situation. So I think it was probably more of a you probably see more change, more social, I guess, responsibility of the operators to be, I guess, proactive in trying to solve the challenge which has been identified, which definitely is around responsible gambling. And that's a case of, I think, working very carefully with the ecosystem and all of the pillars that are involved with the way in which players engage with their services. And like Tina mentioned, whether it be working closer with the payments providers, there's some really interesting, I guess, initiatives from those payment providers who are allowing customers to stop any funds going to a gambling operator. Again, it's like a friendly way to time out or just to prevent that payment happening, and that's quite nice for both an offline as well as an online world. I guess another big element around that, and the regulator hasn't done this yet in the UK, but we certainly see it across the European world, certainly in the financial service space, is actually a definition around biometrics. We kind of talked about it quite a bit today. It's certainly a position we see as critical for the world of remote identity. And it seems to follow true with what the regulators are doing, and they are actually saying that you need to have greater proof on who that person is at the point of sign up to that point potentially further down the line when they are from an ongoing element. So yeah, far more emphasis on identity.
And then we've had an interesting perspective come through here from an audience member today. And James, I'd love to hear your viewpoint on it, basically suggesting that as a government entity, the Gambling Commission should perhaps create an initiative where they actually verify players themselves and allocate them an identity number. I'd be intrigued to hear what your view on that would be, James.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's brilliant. I think that whole concept aligns fantastically well with, I guess, the initiatives that you see around GDPR and also around PSD2, which is ultimately putting identifiable information in the hands of the individual. And the reason I say that is this is not something which is being commercialized or are there any profiteering associated with it, but actually providing a means, what I would describe here is potentially a stepping stone to a form of portable identity that could then be used in multiple spheres, whether it be from a gaming element, which is ultimately from the, I guess if it's under the GC, then it could work brilliantly, again, both land-based as well as online, to potentially even expanding that further afield to actually all the other components which comprise, I guess, the ecosystem of I guess the wider breadth of the financial service sphere. So the payment gateways that you use and the payment tools and basically how that all strings together, because ultimately your betting account could be everything from to the funds that leave for your mortgage and pay for yourself and your family, to also to I guess the fun that you're having around using that money for other services, such as potentially playing around a golf or having a bet on a horse. So yeah, brilliant. And if people have suggestions on that, obviously please do contact if you believe the GC would be interested in an initiative like that. Then obviously Onfido would be really keen to support in scoping out how that could look.
Yeah, I think it would certainly be an interesting thing to see how that would come together. And from what they've said, they've got a pretty clear idea of how it should. So I definitely welcome that member of the audience to reach out. So moving on to the next question we've got through. You mentioned in the presentation that establishing a risk profile for users extends beyond the point of onboarding. So is there a case for introducing re-authentication of users? I suppose that would be James. Would you want to touch on that first?
Yes, yeah, happy to. I mean, certainly there is that at the moment, I guess, when we took a look at re-authentication, is that sits primarily around a username and password, which can be accessed and utilized by anyone. I mean, if we think about that journey here, if you have what I would probably call potentially the risk of friendly fraud, so it's probably going to sit around the underage element, or potentially, and I know Tina will be able to talk directly to this, I guess, the risk around the social and responsible gambling here, of how it's very easy, obviously, to potentially to steal or to borrow or steal a card of your partner's. And really, all you'd need here is, I guess, the 3 numbers on the back of your card to put the money in, the password, and the username, and you could be ultimately call it account abuse, but impersonating and being able to gain access, because that is what is used as identifiable information to that account. So if we took that back and go right back to the beginning of saying, okay, the point of that customer signing up, what do we need to do to help mitigate things further down the line, such as this risk of account abuse, or being able to identify someone with confidence at a later date? It's really going to sit around a little bit more friction at the point of sign up, or a little bit more confidence of who that person is. I talk about this friction because it is probably perceived as more frictionful from that of entering information that you know in your head. But really, ultimately, it's actually just taking who you are and what you have in your pocket as a tool to better authenticate yourself. So it's especially, I guess, it's achieving 2 birds with 1 stone, and maybe multiple opportunities really that you can achieve by actually, I guess, tightening or improving what is currently in place.
Brilliant. And then I think there's a sort of burning question that's come through, but also from me a little bit, but from our audience today as well. Do you think there are still people out there who aren't prepared for this regulation at this late stage? Or do you think it's just more a case of people looking at a more sort of future level, how they're going to adapt to it and drive value from it, as you guys are suggesting?
Well, I think that there's always going to be somebody who's not quite prepared. That is just the way it is. But very quickly they will have to fall into line for no other reason than this is not a discussion. This is coming into practice on the 7th of May, and it's a license requirement. So I would like to hope on behalf of the industry that there isn't anybody who's not prepared. There will obviously be degrees of preparedness, and some people will be doing things now. Others will go active with the change on the 7th of May. But I don't see any reason why people would not be prepared. I think just on the point you raised previously, in terms of a centralized database, we're kind of already there in principle with Gamstop and the national self-exclusion schemes. in that what you have there is a central database which says this customer should not gamble. What we're talking about perhaps is an initiative whereby the Gambling Commission or a government department has a positive database of all the people who are allowed to gamble. Problem you've got is, for a lot of people, they enjoy the anonymity of gambling. You know, somebody once said, I think it might have been Dave Allen, that gambling is a little bit like religion. What you do is between you and your bookie and nobody else. So there is that to consider as well. And in the UK, whenever there is talk of a national ID card, the nation does tend to break out in a collective allergic reaction to it. So I think, yeah, that the principles are there already. It's just how we perhaps take that and put a positive slant on it rather than the negativity of don't let me in. In terms of re-authentication, again, that is already there within the principles of Gamstop. Every time somebody who's registered for Gamstop tries to log in, that check is done. So you already have that kind of, if you will, negative re-authentication. In terms of how the regulations work and how operators should be managing their businesses, most of us know that fraudsters or criminals will come in as regular, normal customers. So if you want to protect your business against the criminals, the drug dealers, the terrorists, etc., they're not going to come in, register and say, hello, here I am, suspend me. They are going to establish the behaviours and the patterns of a regular customer. Until they've established a degree of trust, then they're going to start doing what they really wanted to come and register an account for. So operators should actually be doing that whole monitoring and re-authentication process as part of their due diligence as an ongoing thing. I think what James and Onfido and others can do is help take some of the manual burden out of it. And dilute some of that obvious friction where we're stopping customers and saying, send us something. That's a personal view.
Yeah, thank you, Tina. And just a very, I know of course time, I guess if the call to action, I guess for people who maybe aren't ready, I think there is, from the back office side, you're right, it sounds like this has been around, it's been known for a while, so compliance and operations are probably already well ramped to kind of deliver to this. A person who should be speaking to a lot and working really closely with is your product team, because it is I guess the burden not only on you the business but also on your customers, and there's too much tendency to move away from your UI at the moment. So asking customers to sending emails out and asking customers to email in documents and stuff like that, no one trusts that. No one you see very poor engagement in that channel as well. Because people don't feel protected there. So I would strongly recommend if it's very heavily on the compliance side, work closely with your product team to help ensure you have this amazing customer experience to this new challenge, because it's a good thing. What's happening is good, and it's a great opportunity to make what is ultimately now differentiate from other operators, to have really best-in-class user experiences. To allow you to really impress alongside your branding and the actual services that you can then offer.
Well, as James said, that is all we have time for today. But thank you to both of you for joining us and sharing your insight, and for a fantastic Q&A session. Some really great questions there from the audience as well. So thanks to everyone for sticking around. For our audience, the webinar has been recorded today and will be available to listen to on demand shortly for you to rewatch and share with colleagues. Otherwise, we'll be seeing you very soon. Bye, everyone.